What is tithe or tithing? Tithing is found in the Old Testament where an Israeli was supposed to give 10% of his income. Let us dig a little deeper into what this tithe really is. There were three types of tithe in the Old Testament: the Levitical tithe, the feast tithe, and the orphans and widows tithe. The first was a Levitical tithe that we find in Leviticus 27 and in Numbers 18. We should keep in mind that the state of Israel had a theocratic government. That means it was directly governed by God through the tribe of Levi. The entire tribe of Levi were like the government servants of today. This tithe meant that 10% of all the produce of the land went to the upkeep of these government servants. In other words, we can call it an income tax in today's terminology, which went to the upkeep of the state of Israel. There was another tithe, a further 10% which went to the savings account of the giver himself. 3 times a year, his entire family was required to go to Jerusalem, and this was the money set apart for that purpose. So this 10% was enjoyed by the giver himself. We will find an account of this tithe in Deuteronomy chapter 14. The third was a welfare tithe that we find in Deuteronomy 14 verses 28 and 29. This was also 10% but was to be collected only once in 3 years. This was to be given to the orphans and widows of the land. This is like a welfare tax or an education cess tax of today. In summary, the first tithe that the Israelis paid was in fact an income tax that went to the government. The second tithe was in fact a savings scheme to enable the Israelis pay for their holidays. And the third tax went directly to the orphans and widows of the land. What does the New Testament say about tithing? Tithing basically is never ever advocated in the New Testament. It is never taught in the New Testament. Never. It is referred to a couple of times, that's all, as a historical fact. It talks about the fact that Abraham gave tithes, also of 1/10 of the plunder which he took in the battle with the kings. No place in the entire New Testament is it ever advocated for us to give tithes. That is, for us to give 10% to the church. Before we go into the New Testament position about giving, let us see how these so-called spiritual leaders thrust this burden upon you. They do this by imposing a guilt complex on you. If that fails, they will appeal to your greed to make more money. First, they try and induce a guilt complex in you. Oh, if you don't pay your tithe, they will say, God will punish you and He won't bless you. If they cannot load a guilt complex on you, they will appeal to your greed. If you give $100, they will tell you, God will give you $10,000 back. And what happens is that a lot of gullible people like you will send them a $100 check. They will be laughing all the way to the bank, and you will be waiting for that $10,000 from God, which will never come, as God does not pander to greed. Rest assured, none of your money is going to be used by these people to spread the gospel. It is only used to spread the word about guilt and greed so that they can find more gullible people and make even more money. So what does the New Testament say about giving? We are under grace. We are not under the law. Paul writes a whole chapter to the Galatians about this very topic. His cry to the Galatians in chapter 3 is emotional. Verse 2, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by believing what you heard? Verse 3, after beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? Verse 10, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything that is written in the book of the law. Tithing was a law of the Old Testament, and Paul is extremely clear that we are no longer under the law. What these so-called spiritual leaders are saying is that Paul is talking about the other laws and not the law of tithing. How stupid is that? Paul is talking about the enslaving nature of the law. We in the New Testament age are not bound by the Mosaic law, and that applies to all laws of the Old Testament. And this is the very thing these charlatans use to trap you. Verse 11, clearly no one who relies on the law is justified before God. Verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Verse 24, so the law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. So what does the New Testament teach us about giving? Paul is explaining to the Corinthians how the Macedonians gave. This is what he says. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy, their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. Can you check out the key phrases here? Deep poverty, rich generosity. For I testify, privilege of sharing, service to the Lord's people. I suspect many of them would have gone much beyond the Old Testament 10%. And that, my dear people, is Christian giving. Your money goes to where it is needed and not into buying mansions and airplanes for these TV frauds. And you know something? There is no guilt when you don't give. There is no greed when you do. You do not give expecting anything back, because where your money is going, there is no way that those poor folks are going to be able to pay you back. And further, there is joy in your giving, whatever the amount is. You give cheerfully. Take a look at what Paul says in chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians verse 7. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. If tithing was a New Testament requirement, Paul would have said, each of you should give your tithes without fail, for God would punish those who don't give their tithes. And that is how your giving should be, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, but cheerfully in joy. This is what New Testament giving looks like. Let us look at this from another angle. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, at the present time your plenty will supply what they need. Now read this verse with James chapter 2 verse 15. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? Now, the sheep and the goats of Matthew 25 will make a lot more sense. Do you remember this passage? He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. God's children are precious to him. One of the characteristics of a Christian is to love God's children. John says in 1 John 2:9, anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or a sister is still in the darkness. Notice that Jesus is talking to the sheep on his right. That's right, to all believers. This is the mark of true Christians. They will look after their own because they love their brothers and sisters. And that is where your money should go, not to the pockets of Benny Hinn or Joyce Meyer. Do you see these guys sending money to the poor and the suffering? No. It stays in their banks or finances their mansions and jets. Similarly, please don't support churches that store your money in fixed deposits. God bless you.